Welcome back to Risky Business, a show about making better decisions. I'm Maria Konnikova.
And I'm Nate Silver. Today on the show, have you been canceled ever, Maria?
I have not been canceled. Have you ever been canceled, Nate?
Oh, people have tried. If you listen to the last episode with Eliona, you come at the king, you best not
Yep.
miss. Fucking Blue Sky, idiots on fucking Twitter, and now they moved to Blue Sky. Yeah.
Tell us how you really feel, Nate, about...
No, it's a strategy of the weak. Sometimes.
It is. No,
Sometimes.
it is.
Not
And
in this
sometimes
case.
of
Not
the
in this
strong.
case. Today in the show, we're going to be talking a little bit about Jimmy Kimmel on this. Maria, I think you're going to have some historical points of view. I'll just be ranting. You'll provide the evidence. I'll just have takes.
We will go into some historical context and just situate the current situation in a discussion of free speech and how it has evolved throughout the history of the United States. So on that note, Nate, let's talk some Jimmy Kimmel. So last week, Jimmy Kimmel's show was canceled indefinitely by the powers that be at Disney and ABC. And we just found out the Jimmy Kimmel live show is going to be returning tomorrow. By the time you guys hear this Wednesday, it will have been last night. But I do want to stress that we have not actually seen or heard the return yet. But yes, they just made an announcement that they will be bringing Jimmy Kimmel back to the air after discussions with Mr. Kimmel about the future. And the original cancellation was very, very different from anything we've talked about on the show in terms of like cancel. No, in some ways. Hold on. May I finish? In terms of cancel culture, because it was coming from Brendan Carr, the chairman of the FCC, who exerted pressure on the brass at Disney to cancel the show and made some very veiled, but not that veiled threats that, we're probably going to pull your license.
It was like, hey, we can do it the easy way or the hard way. You sound like
exactly. It sounded like we were back in the Sopranos, or Sopranos.
A worse written version of the Sopranos. Yeah.
Yes. A much worse written version of The Sopranos, someone who didn't actually know how to write and decided the easy way or the hard way was the way to write this dialogue. But yeah, so that's what happened. And that's why I said that's different from what we've been talking about, because there's, cancel culture, and then there's the chairman of the FCC saying, hey, if you can say anything we don't like, we're going to yank your license. In response, there were tons of protests. There was a lot of people canceling their subscriptions to Hulu, ABC, ESPN, all of these things. I do want to give some background to this in a second, but while we're setting kind of the present day context, I'm curious what you think the financial impact of this was, because I saw a lot of people canceling subscriptions that I wouldn't have expected, and I wonder if this is in any way a financial decision as well, whether that actually had an effect or not. I don't know. I want to think that it did, but I'm actually just curious what your take on that particular element is.
Yeah, and I worked for Disney for 10 years. I worked for ESPN and ABC News. So full disclosure, I have a pension, some of which is in Disney stock, but I also hate their guts, so that bias probably outweighs my financial motivation. These companies tend to make decisions very expediently, is one way I would put it, right? Maybe you have people who have vision about individual products, right? I think at the end of the day, Bob Iger cares about theme parks and movies and big franchise IP, these gigantic projects, and probably sees ABC News as this thing that still I think probably makes money. I mean, TV news does not get the ratings it wants to, but it's not that expensive to produce as compared to scripted drama or things like that. But increasingly, these big networks have wondered, do we even want to be in the news business at all? The head of Disney doesn't really care about the creative or journalistic integrity, except to the extent that it might create problems for talent down the line. The precedent I would draw is to the Washington Post, which is owned by Jeff Bezos. I'm a keen observer of media, particularly when it comes to covering American domestic politics, right? I would say 5 or 10 years ago, that people would say, well, the New York Times is the most prestigious and highest grossing newspaper, at least center-left newspaper media brand in America. But the Washington Post is nipping at their heels. They have a lot of talent on domestic politics. They're kind of co-equal. They break a lot of stories. They win a lot of Pulitzers. And they've made one decision after another that have led to a lot of the other kind of canceled subscriptions. When they squashed a op-ed endorsing Kamala Harris. And again, I don't really think that newspapers should be in the business of endorsing candidates, at least for national office. I've always found that strange. In some ways, I find the distinction between op-ed and news kind of strange. But that led to, I think, maybe tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of canceled subscriptions. And meanwhile, if you look at the talent, right? If you took the 50 biggest name brands at the Washington Post from 2 years ago, I think literally half might be gone. And a lot of those are voluntary based on feel like did not have editorial support of the masthead. And, that's a challenge. I mean, it might be in a world where I think the Washington Post has significantly declined in both revenue and relevance, right? And they're going to be very sensitive to things like Hulu subscriptions. That's the way these businesses work, right? Again, ordinarily, sometimes I think boycotts are a little pretentious and silly. The way these big, gigantic, generic kind of media brands work is, they don't want to get yelled at by people, right? They're risk averse. And so if they're well, this could jeopardize our whole business. And I think that's probably part of it. I mean, one thing to understand about Trump is he does a lot of things that I think are very extreme and objectionable. And I think this is one of the clear things that is classic authoritarian, capital A, right? You look at Turkey or Russia or other countries where there's been a pullback from democracy, and finding a pretense to cancel broadcast licenses is capital A authoritarian. They did kind of pull back, and Carr kind of said, well, I was just pontificating and well, it's important that they, and people have this heuristic where they'll kind of discount what Trump said.
It is, they could have not pulled back. Yes, this is true.
No, but I will say, since I criticized him in my newsletter over the weekend, I will say good for Disney for uncanceling Kimmel, who, by the way, did fuck up in some ways. The fuck up is that he said or strongly implied that the person who allegedly killed Charlie Kirk was MAGA, and that MAGA Made America Great Again, was trying to deny the fact that he was MAGA. Kimmel said that on Monday evening's episode, based on really no evidence whatsoever, based on kind of what I think are properly called kind of conspiracy theories on Blue Sky and Twitter, and everyone uses the phrase insensitivity. I think to a certain extent, the job of comedians is to press the line on sensitivity. So I think sensitivity is a dumb euphemism, right? Jimmy Kimmel spread misinformation, but I tell you what, who hasn't at some point? It's scripted TV. It's not live TV. Another reason I'm less forgiving, but it's far, far below a canceling offense, right? Or a firing offense.
And just to give a bit of history to that particular point, but then I also want to go even a little further back to highlight something else that you said. There was a pretty substantial Supreme Court decision back in 1964, New York Times versus Sullivan. And that decision came out of an ad that the New York Times had run. And they basically were trying to contribute donations to defend MLK on perjury charges. And the ad had some factual inaccuracies. And L.B. Sullivan, who's the Sullivan of the case, said that he felt personally criticized, even though he was never actually mentioned by name in the ad. He sent a request to the Times to retract the information and wanted damages. The Times refused. Anyway, this went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court ruled in favor of the Times and established a standard known as the actual malice standard, or reckless disregard of the truth. So basically, if you want to win a libel suit, you have to prove that the person who was making the statement knew it was false and acted with a malicious purpose, right? With an intent to harm the subject, which was a huge win for free speech, because these factual inaccuracies that were in the ad, they weren't on purpose, right? It's not like they wanted to take this guy down. And so, but they just said, okay, yeah, like factual inaccuracies, but it's not enough to suspend our license and to get rid of this. And this was kind of a landmark First Amendment free speech decision. But something that I want to kind of go back even further in history, the reason, by the way, that I invoke the actual malice standard is I think that Jimmy Kimmel, also you can be factually inaccurate and not actually fall afoul of that standard, right? You didn't say it knowing that you were blatantly saying something untrue. I think at the time he probably thought that he was saying something that was right. Whether, he was correct journalistically or not is a different story. But going even further back, Nate, one of the things that you said was that, networks, places like Disney, are constantly playing this calculus, right? They don't want to get criticized, and they're trying to figure out, like, what do we do? How do we sidestep that? And it's really interesting to me because I think that all of the free speech attacks in the United States have shown this kind of constant calculus, and it's not always worked out the way that the person thought it was. So I think the oldest kind of attack goes back to 1798 with the Sedition Act, right? And this was John Adams when he basically said that they were in a war with France. It wasn't a declared war, and he wanted to silence media critics of the government. And so he said that it was passed an act that said it was unlawful to publish any, quote, false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government, end quote. And the measures were huge. Fines up to $2,000. I mean, how much is that? I don't even know. In 1798, like, that's insane. 2 years in prison. And so a lot of publications started censoring themselves. But what ended up happening, they actually used it very punitively. They ended up, sending people to jail. Several newspapers had to shut down. But what ended up happening was that there was a huge backlash against this. This was the end of the Federalists. Jefferson came to power on like a huge wave of support. And even later, the Justice Samuel Chase of the Supreme Court, who had been very pro-Sedition Act, he was impeached for this. So basically everyone was galvanized against it. So it ended up just having a huge backlash to that attempt to stem free speech. Happened again during World War I with Woodrow Wilson, who was a scholar who had actually defended free speech, and he tried to get another Sedition Act. Then we had McCarthyism in the 50s, who tried to bully journalists and do all of that. That again, big backlash. The people who stood up to McCarthyism have fared much better in the eyes of history than the people like McCarthy himself. Then we've got New York Times versus Sullivan. Then we get Richard Nixon. And so it's very funny when you started saying that you think the best kind of example is the Washington Post. I thought you were going to go in a totally different direction, because the other time that an FCC license was threatened was against the Washington Post when they were trying to publish the Pentagon Papers. They published them anyway, and obviously they won that battle. But Nixon was probably, other than Trump, the single most vindictive president against the media. He ousted Stuart Laurie for an article that he wrote in 1971 for the LA Times. So he actually just banned him from the White House. And, he basically said that the press, whom he started calling the media, that comes from Nixon, was the enemy, and told his vice president, Spiro Agnew, to constantly attack the media. He referred to them as a small and unelected elite, and basically create a rift so that people wouldn't trust the media. And he even threatened lawsuits if anyone used Tricky Dick in print. So that, it became incredibly petty. And he did kind of this, Trump is really taking a page out of his playbook in a way, because he had the IRS investigate tax returns by Seymour Hersh and other journalists that the White House didn't really like. And so the thing that I found that I thought was the most ridiculous is this was pre-Watergate. Gordon Liddy and Howard Hunt discussed murdering a journalist Jack Anderson, like actually killing him so that he would stop basically the leaks that were damaging to Nixon and to the administration and stop any further criticism of the administration. They considered things like putting LSD on his steering wheel so that he would start hallucinating while driving his car and get into a car crash.
Free LSD.
Yeah, exactly. I don't think they realized how LSD. Yeah. Anyway, this is a quote from Liddy. He said, "I would have knifed him or broken his neck." End quote. So we see these sorts of attacks in the past, and every single time they have not worked out well. But every single time the media has actually fought back. Right? The Washington Post published Pentagon Papers. Laurie had a career in journalism, like people would hire him after that. And Seymour Hersh, obviously Pulitzer Prize, like all of these people are storied journalists and people who had the support of the country. And with Kimmel at the beginning, it was the first time that an organization had gotten a threat from the FCC, and rather than saying, no, fuck you, we're the media, and this is freedom of press, said, okay, we'll fire you, until they didn't. So this is, I think, a very interesting moment, but those historical precedents, I think, are really interesting to keep in mind, especially because they did not turn out well for the government.
Yeah, look, I think with anything we're covering in today's age, you have to be aware that most commentators have a bias toward thinking history begins when they're age 8. You know what I mean?
Right.
You know, in the longer sweep of like, how does this moment in America relate to there's a lot of violence in the 60s, right? The Civil War. I mean, that, you know, yep. I think one has to be careful with those comparisons, and it might be concerning enough that we seem to be losing decades of progress on some issues, right?
Yep.
I mean, there was the other precedent, which is, you know, do you know who Jimmy Kimmel replaced on ABC?
I don't remember. I don't follow this stuff.
Bill Maher. Because Bill Maher's politically incorrect got canceled because he said the 9/11 terrorists were courageous and we are not lobbing cruise missiles from thousands of miles away, right? He said that like 7 days after 9/11, it was litigated in the press for a much longer time. Eventually, his show was let lapse, and then he went to HBO, and I'm sure made lots of money and became more famous.
Still there,
yeah.
Yep.
Part of cancellation, and now I want to be clear, I thought that their cancel culture was a thing, that liberals, I call them progressives because it's a very illiberal attitude, right? That progressives really were bloodthirsty for a number of years, kind of peaking in the year 2020 or so. I thought it was an embarrassment to the liberal tradition of free speech. I think they're petty and jealous, and they don't understand how in a relatively free country that when you suppress speech, it usually only makes it more compelling and more powerful, right? And they thought they could contain the information ecosystem. They accomplished nothing that they wanted, and they have direct moral responsibility for contributing to a climate in which free speech is compromised. With that said, Maria, as you said, people have always been hypocritical about free speech. The definition's always been contingent and evolving in practice, right? So, you know, if you were around for September 11th when Bill Maher got canceled, the Dixie Chicks and Phil Donahue, you know, you're not surprised very much by any of this. And now if I'm Trump, now it's my turn. And I think justifiably, there was a lot of bullshit from progressives when they were in power, right? And we want revenge, right? And by the way, I don't think progressives have often stood up for like the higher-minded principles either, right? They don't think like good poker players where it's like, okay, what is the equilibrium if everybody adopts this attitude? It's kind of Kantian, like the golden rule, right? How does society get along if you know, literally just put yourself in the person's shoes and say, eventually a Republican's going to win back in office. And by the way, eventually there will be a Democrat back in office, maybe in I guess we're early in the Trump term, 3.5 years, right? You know, turnabout will be fair play then, but like perpetually you're losing.
Yeah, no, I think that we forget that free speech was created to protect speech we don't like. Not speech that we agree with. People forget this all the time. They're like, yes, free speech. Wait, you said something that I disagree with. You can't say that. And we've said this on the show before. And, I don't want to constantly give you history lessons, but remember, we talked about Skokie, Illinois, Nate, and and the ACLU on this show before. For people who missed that episode, it was basically kind of a case that went to the Supreme Court that involved letting neo-Nazis march in a predominantly Jewish community, and the ACLU took it on. And I still remember learning about that and being like, holy shit, like, fuck those guys. But yes, like, you have to protect the speech that you most disagree with, because that's the whole point. That is what free speech means. It means that we can disagree. It means that we can have civil discourse. It means that we can all have all of these different ideas, and it's okay. So I actually, Nate, agree with you that, the liberals went way too far. I think this was the case in academia. I think this was the case at my alma mater, Harvard, where certain professors lost their jobs, right, for espousing for engaging in research that was not politically correct. And that's not what academia is about. As long as you are not academically dishonest, as long as you're actually kind of trying to figure out what the truth is, you're allowed to hold different opinions. But I think that, as you say, we've devolved. Like, this is horrifying, like that this is now the spiral, right? And instead, you need to kind of reset and go back to those first principles and say, okay, free speech, we're for it. The Supreme Court has to say this country is for free speech, and the FCC can't be threatening licenses because of something somebody said that they don't like. And we can't be in a climate, after that, Trump doubled down and said, yeah, you shouldn't criticize the president if we don't like you or you say something bad about me. There are going to be consequences. I mean, it's insane, right, for a president to say that. But we're at the point where there are a lot of people who don't think it's insane and who are like, yeah, serves you right. You shouldn't criticize the president. And the funniest thing is, what has prompted this whole conversation is the death of Charlie Kirk, who I think, I didn't know him, and I didn't know much about him until he died, to be perfectly honest. But I think he would be someone who actually would be opposed to all of this, because he was a proponent of free speech.
No, and a lot of these videos have circulated on social media of him, like, debating on college campuses was kind of like his big thing. And like, he was good at that. And the whole idea was, it's an open forum, come debate me, bro. Right. And like, and he had Ben Shapiro, who is a unambiguously conservative commentator, but clearly a very smart guy. Right. And it's like, okay, like, what if you can't respect Charlie Kirk and Ben Shapiro, who, again, I'm not super left, but like, I probably agree with them on 20 or 30% of issues and disagree on 70 or 80%, right? What equilibrium are you envisioning where conservatives exist? And like, if you can't tolerate, here, I'll get myself in trouble with probably only a very small fraction of our audience, right? There aren't that many, I don't think, super eloquent spokespeople for the Trumpian movement. And yet, half the country, 49.9%, he won the popular vote, half the country voted for it last time. And you have to live in that world. And if you're not going to give a platform to Ben Shapiro or Charlie Kirk, then who the fuck are you going to give a platform to? You know what I mean? You have to be willing to have, again, I believe in speech broadly. I just don't think of speech as the Free Amendment, but I believe in we have to have a more tolerance is a word I would use, right? A more tolerant ecosystem for disagreement.
Absolutely. More tolerant. And I would also say kinder, right? Where your knee-jerk reaction isn't like, fuck this person, but okay, this doesn't sound right to me, but where are you coming from? Like, to try to understand, right? To at least try to come from a place of kindness and not a place of pitchforks and like, let's burn you down, which is, I think, to bring this back to Kimmel, which is I think the natural end of all of this rhetoric is, we're going to burn you down and we're going to remove you from the air and we're going to threaten the license of your parent company and we're going to show you who's boss. And as you started off, the segment by saying, Nate, this is authoritarianism with a capital A 101, right? Like, this is the playbook. Like, this is what you do, is you take opposition, you take things that you don't agree with, and instead of tolerating them, having discourse, you just remove it. You say no, and then you remove the people, and next step, jail. Right, like that's what happens next. You start jailing the journalists. You don't just remove them from air. And this has happened in the United States before, and we had come a long, long way since then. And now it seems like we're devolving again, and that's not where you want to be going. The United States has been falling, right, on all of the rankings of freedom of press and freedom of society. All of those global rankings, all of a sudden the United States has gone from being a leader to, in some cases, falling out of the top 10. And I don't think that that's where we want to be as a country. And as you say, if you actually game out this game, it ain't ending well. Like, it doesn't end well when this is the way that people end up responding. So on that note, I think that it's definitely very promising that Kimmel is being brought back. Like I said, we're taping this on Monday, and I keep stressing that because I'm very curious to know what he's going to sound like when he comes on the air, because there's also, as we talked about last week, Nate, chilling effects, right, and self-censorship. And you can imagine a future where people are like, okay, well, I'm just going to tread really lightly and not talk about certain people and not talk about certain topics and engage in self-censorship, which people have been doing for a number of years. And I think that happened with the first wave of actual cancel culture. I keep wanting to stress that the Kimmel thing is different because it was coming from the FCC. So that's censorship. That's media censorship, which is a very different thing.
It's different. I mean, there are, different does not necessarily mean worse or better. And I feel like people are like...
In this case, I think it means worse. I understand the word does not, but I think government censorship is worse than individual.
I kind of believe in the fourth estate in the sense of like media, both kind of upper highbrow media, meaning like the New York Times and publications like that, and kind of lower media like mass entertainment. Like, they have a lot of shared cultural power. So like, I think they're equal to a branch of government de facto in terms of the amount of power they have. And when they act in unison, right, when you organize attempts to cancel people that may originate, from progressives to deny them a livelihood, like it's different. I'm not saying it's necessarily better. It's probably less capital A authoritarian. I was never that convinced, but you also had a little bit of light arm twisting.
It's also terrible. It's also awful. Like I'm not trying to say anything nice about the Jeff Bezoses of the world. Don't get me wrong. I think that it's really scary on that level too.
I would like to see more liberals, especially if they want to have the moral high ground. If progressives want to say, we're just in a fucking wrestling match with the GOP and we'll win through not brute force, but we'll win we think we're smarter, we'll win a tactically battle or whatever else, right? I would like to say, I've seen a couple, like Abby Phillip, who was an anchor on CNN, right, had a good segment about this, but like, I would like to see more liberals say, we fucked up, right? We fucked up by abandoning free speech as a principle, by pretending, all these people that do the canceling, they never have any heterodox, quote unquote, opinions themselves, right? They always like have cookie cutter opinions because they're not actually, I don't like these people, so I'm not going to say anything overly generous, right? I think a lot of people formulate their political beliefs because of peer pressure, right? And one of the problems with journalism and kind of the liberal academy more broadly is like, and that includes a lot of fucking lonely souls who are looking to be joiners, right? And I'm against that. I think if you've never pissed an audience off or your own audience off, then like how can you have lived in a very complicated world like we live in for decades and not at some point had an opinion that differed from your tribe, right? That's totally fine if you just want to go and open a nice little pasta restaurant or something and get along with your customers, right? But if you're a political commentator and you've never said anything that pisses someone off, then you are fucking terrible at your job. You shouldn't be canceled because I don't believe in cancellation, right? But that's just a tell that you don't have any independent-minded opinions. And if you always line with one party, the parties are these weird monstrosities. It's like saying, I think that PepsiCo, everything it's like being a fanboy of PepsiCo or Coca-Cola or something, right? Like everything this gigantic faceless corporation makes is the best thing on earth, right? It's, that's what the political parties are. They're these kind of mediocre, gigantic brands that are trying to cater to the mass consumer and are pretty darn good at it, right? But you're just being a fanboy if you're always always advocating the party line.
Oh, absolutely, absolutely. You're being a brand spokesperson. I think actually the tie that you made to Coke or Pepsi or something like that is a really good one, right? You're just being a brand spokesperson for the Republican Party or the Democratic Party. And this is something that you and I talk about on this show frequently. I don't think either one of us likes the two-party system. One of the main problems I have with it is that it discourages independent thinking, right? Too many people are like, oh, I'm a this, I'm a that. You apply the label and then you figure out, what do I think based on that? Not what do I think, therefore who do I support? People don't get that granular. Of course, some people do, but that kind of critical independent thinking is something that we should be encouraging, we should be fostering, we should be creating a culture where people are rewarded for heterodoxy, not for its own sake, but just for having their own mind and for being able to say what they think. And there are, you can agree, you can disagree. And as we've already said, this doesn't mean just saying anything that, pops up in your mind. I'm not going to defend someone's right to say the earth is flat. Well, they can say it, but it's wrong, right? There are facts. And so you can't just start taking these things to extremely absurd conclusions. But yeah, we should be living in a society where people think for themselves. And this is something that both parties are absolutely to blame for. And we are not in a good place right now. So I really hope that everyone comes to their senses, including the Supreme Court, and that we actually start supporting free speech and what it actually means, right? Which means that Jimmy Kimmel could have fucked up something that he said and then said, oh, this wasn't actually true, and he wasn't removed from the air. It's kind of that sort of a culture, as opposed to one where we start getting threats and trying to strong arm people into kowtowing whatever the party line happens to be, right? Which could be liberal, and it could be Republican, and it could be either one. I think that's such an incredibly dangerous moment. It really does bring me back to the Soviet Union, and that is not a good feeling.
Yeah, and also create more stigma for cowardice. I mean, there were some people,
yes,
in the whole Charlie Kirk Kimmel thing. I mean, Ted Cruz of all people.
Oh, I was about to say, I actually agreed with Ted Cruz for once in my life. I was like, what is happening? Ted Cruz was like, this is bad.
You probably are more familiar with the research on this, right? But when a small number of people who are influential or actually have something to lose, right, when they speak up, even Michael Eisner, the former CEO of Disney, I don't know if he's a frenemy with Bob Iger or a rival, but he said, what the fuck are you doing, Bob, right? And I'm sure that's, Disney's a company where people are usually pretty nice, right? And so that might have had an influence too, right?
Yes, there's a lot of research on that, Nate. It's a very good point. And yes, all it takes is even just one influential voice, and that can completely change the dynamic and what people feel empowered to say or do.
It's also not a bad thing to show some respect and courtesy, especially when a traumatic event has occurred, right? But people exploit that is a problem, right? That's why, insensitivity, I'd rather have somebody who's insensitive but acting in good faith than smarmy fucking bullshit.
Yeah, I completely agree. So yeah, let's see. listeners, we're from the past. You in the future will already have seen how this played out. But this is a really interesting topic, and I think one that we are going to keep revisiting on this show. And I hope, Nate, that our show is still on the air, even if we say something that, the FCC might not like.
What's your most cancelable opinion? See, that's like not a question you can answer. Right?
Yeah, well, let's come back to that. I think that'll be an interesting segment. No, I think that is an interesting segment.
What's the most cancelable opinion that it's actually your 7th most cancelable opinion, probably? You know what I mean?
Right. You have to do the game theory of that, and you have to play that out. Well, we hope you've enjoyed this. Oh, enjoyed's the wrong word. We hope you feel more educated about free speech, which is something that really is core to Risky Business and to our ability to have this show. And to me, as an ex-Soviet immigrant, it's something near and dear to my heart. So good luck, Jimmy Kimmel. I hope that your return to the air was a good one.